Please help me welcome Minister McKenna.
Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you to the elders, to National Chief Bellegarde, to the regional chiefs, to the Advisory Committee on Climate Action and the Environment, to representatives of the Youth Council and the Women's Council, and all chiefs and representatives of First Nations communities here today. Thank you for hosting us. I'd like to first recognize that we're on Treaty 4 lands, and it is important in my job that we always recognize that First Nations are the first stewards of the land, the water, and the air, and the protectors of our animals. I'd also like to take just a moment to acknowledge the wildfire situation in British Columbia. My thoughts are with those displaced and affected by the wildfires, and I'm heartened by the resilience and courage demonstrated by these communities that many of you in the room are part of. It's a great honor to be here again, and I bring greetings on behalf of the Prime Minister and the Government of Canada. I come here today inspired by strong messages of learning, healing, and collaboration. I was honored to have the opportunity to be invited by the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs to visit the Turtle Lodge in Saugeen First Nation yesterday. I met with elders and land users, and they shared with me their concerns about impacts on the land and their desire to contribute to environmental protection through their knowledge, their experience, and cultural protocols. We sat, we talked, we broke bread, and we learned from each other. Elders shared with me a document describing the outcomes of the AFN Climate Summit held in June, which brought together Indigenous knowledge keepers and international climate leaders. This is a fantastic example of communities contributing to climate change action. I love hearing stories of Indigenous leadership on climate change, and I applaud all the work you are doing and the efforts to do it together. Being here today is very timely. As you heard from my colleague and friend, Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould this morning, our government took another important step to renew Canada's nation-to-nation relationship by releasing the principles respecting the Government of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. The principles state that our government recognizes that Indigenous self-determination and laws are critical to Canada's future, and that Indigenous perspectives and rights must be incorporated in all aspects of this relationship. These continue to be fundamental in all discussions in relation to the environment. I want to emphasize that we're committed to a government to the full implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the recognition of Aboriginal and treaty rights. Indigenous rights are the foundation of the nation-to-nation relationship, and we will work together to ensure they are respected. When I was here last year, it was noted that it had been 10 years since a federal environment minister addressed the AFN General Assembly. It was a great honor to be blanketed at that gathering, and it will always serve as a reminder of the critical importance of our journey together. Since I took office over a year and a half ago, we've been steadily focused on rebuilding the nation-to-nation relationship. We began our work together in Paris, where Indigenous leaders, many of you, joined the Canadian delegation to advocate for climate action on climate change at the international level. I'm very proud of the work we did together to push for the adoption of the Paris Agreement, and also to advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples and the inclusion of Indigenous traditional knowledge in that document. We have since brought home our commitments and are working bilaterally with the Assembly of First Nations and rights holders to implement our climate action plan. We will carry that momentum forward into COP23 in Bonn as we continue to push for ambitious action to address climate change. The meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples will be an important part of that process. At COP21, there was a commitment to establish an Indigenous peoples platform to support the engagement of Indigenous peoples in climate action. We are leading the work on this platform with First Nations and other Indigenous groups and have invited Indigenous representatives from across the globe to join us in Ottawa for a workshop this fall to discuss how to ensure that the Indigenous Peoples Platform is an effective vehicle for Indigenous participation in international climate advocacy. We engaged with the AFN and First Nations across the country in the development of the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change and Clean Growth, or as I call it, the Made in Canada Climate Change Plan. There's a great deal of work to do to ensure that the impacts of climate change are addressed, and it is going to require a lot of effort from each and every one of us. We're gathered here today as leaders, and as leaders, we must stand firm and push for climate action. I would encourage all of you to continue to be strong voices. This is the greatest challenge we face. But it is also an enormous opportunity. First Nations are at the forefront of some of Canada's most innovative climate solutions. For example, the Sauk Nation in British Columbia is a community powered completely by solar power. It is so popular that they now have an ecotourism business bringing in more than 2,000 people a year for solar tours and workshops. How awesome is that? As I always say, the environment and the economy go together. We also know that adaptation measures need to be guided by Indigenous knowledge. One story that stuck with me was a presentation I heard last spring by Andrea Brazeau, an Indigenous youth leader from northern Quebec. She told us how 15 years ago, people in her community would know how to hunt caribou to help feed and support the family. But now, her younger brother in that same community has never even seen a live caribou. A big reason for this is because the landscape has changed due to climate change. Her community now has less country food, and they're forced to pay very high prices for foods shipped across long distances. She also spoke about how oral history and traditions that have been passed down for many generations are now becoming lost because a major part of their cultural history, being able to predict the weather, is no longer possible because of the impacts of climate change. I love it that the focus of this year's annual General Assembly is our priority, our children, our future. There is no better way to honor our children than to take action now to address climate change and build a more sustainable future. And I say that as a mother to 3 children. We've heard from Indigenous peoples across the country that we also need to address concerns about how major projects are assessed and evaluated. This includes building a new environmental assessment system that supports reconciliation and recognizes and respects First Nations rights and interests, their deep connection to the land, to territories and resources, and the desire for First Nations to participate as partners in the economic development of their territories. That's why, almost immediately after forming government, we quickly moved to implement an interim approach for environmental assessments to guide decisions on projects already in the system. Principles based on meaningful consultation with Indigenous peoples and accommodation of rights and of interests. In addition to the interim principles, we've held meetings with First Nations leadership since early 2016, which really helped set the context for the launch of the environmental and regulatory reviews, which myself, Ministers Carr, Garneau, and LeBlanc all are working on together with support from Ministers Bennett, Duncan, and Minister Wilson-Raybould. We knew and we know that we need to take a whole-of-government approach to these reviews, to build a new environmental assessment system, to modernize the National Energy Board, and to restore lost protections to the Fisheries Act and the Navigation Protection Act. While each review has its own distinct processes, like my expert panel that reviewed the environmental assessment system, there have been intersecting areas of responsibility, and we've been working collaboratively on the common aspects of these reviews. And throughout, consultation with Indigenous peoples has been at the core, with the understanding that Indigenous peoples need and must have a greater role in environmental assessment processes. We've also been paying close attention to the submissions and ideas that so many of you have provided to my expert panel and government officials, and also to me and my team. Thank you for taking the time to contribute to this process and for sharing your reviews on the expert panel. Your participation has been invaluable in developing our understanding of the issues and identifying potential solutions. We're working hard this summer with all of this input in mind, and we will continue to work together to put these ideas and shared values into practice. We have to rethink how we work together so that the nation-to-nation relationship defines our systems instead of our systems defining the nation-to-nation relationship. In that regard, I would like to recognize the work of my colleagues, Minister Bennett and Minister Wilson-Raybould, for the leadership they have shown within government to help us understand the work that we all need to do to build better relationships. They are both strong advocates for change, and their commitment and dedication is driving the Government of Canada to learn faster and reach farther than we have ever gone before. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank some folks up here, Regional Chiefs Isadore Day, Kevin Hart, and Bill Erasmus, personally, for the time and commitment that you have invested in sharing views on the environmental assessment and regulatory review processes. Your advocacy and experience has helped us to critically examine how we approach engagement and collaboration with First Nations as part of this review. Early in the process, these regional chiefs extended an invitation to me and my colleagues to work with the Assembly of First Nations Advisory Committee on Climate Action and the Environment, the appropriately named ACE Committee, to develop solutions and build better processes. Also, our technical team has been engaging with Indigenous governments and communities all across the country. These discussions, along with direct engagement with rights holders, are helping to shape our understanding of how to develop new, fair, and effective processes for environmental assessments in Canada based on respect and partnership. We need to work with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples to ensure that our solutions are your solutions and that the new system is better than the old system. That is why I've made a commitment to the co-chairs of the Assembly of First Nations ACE Committee to collaborate in a co-development process to guide and inform the policies and guidelines that will underpin the environmental assessment and regulatory review process by focusing on the key areas where we can work together. As we go forward, we will be on tight timelines, but it's absolutely critical that we advance this legislation to ensure that all the hard work that we are doing that has supported building better environmental assessment processes is implemented before the next election. I'd like to think we'll win, but you never know. We will need to make things work for both sides of the table in our respective systems, but I'm confident that if we start with collaboration and partnership, we can achieve better outcomes together. Last month, our government released a discussion paper with our proposed approach to environmental and regulatory process. We are sharing our ideas so that we have the opportunity to understand from you what we are getting right and where we will need to adjust. This is just a draft, and we are seeking your input. We understand that reconciliation must guide partnerships with Indigenous peoples, recognizing and respecting the rights and interests their deep connection to the lands, territories, and resources, and desire to participate as partners in the economic development of their territories. We also understand that reconciliation requires sustained government-wide action and needs to be at the center of our consultation and accommodation activities. We believe that our current system can be improved through early and regular engagement and participation based on recognition of Indigenous rights and interests from the outset, seeking to achieve free, prior, and informed consent through processes based on mutual respect and dialogue. Indigenous peoples want a renewed relationship with the federal government consistent with the Constitution and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Mandatory consideration of Indigenous knowledge must be used in environmental assessments. We need to understand and respect this knowledge, and we need to work with elders and knowledge holders in order to use this knowledge effectively and to protect it appropriately. We need direct engagement between the Crown and Indigenous peoples to discuss and understand potential project impacts to facilitate early planning and issue identification. We need to be responsive to Indigenous rights, jurisdiction, and decision-making, with space created to enable increased Indigenous involvement, including Indigenous-led assessments. We need greater participation of Indigenous peoples on assessment boards and review panels and in regulatory processes. And we need to create opportunities for Indigenous partnerships and co-development in monitoring and building on systems in Canada's north. We will continue to work with the ACE Committee and rights holders to develop these concepts further and ensure that they serve as effective ways for involvement in assessment processes. Indigenous knowledge will be prioritized in these processes. At a recent meeting with the Assembly of First Nations Advisory Committee on Climate Action and the Environment, one of the elders invited me to work with them to develop a policy framework when it comes to Indigenous knowledge. I'm pleased to say now that the Assembly of First Nations Elder Council is working with Environment and Climate Change Canada to develop principles for Indigenous knowledge, which will help to inform the consideration of Indigenous knowledge as we build a new environmental assessment system. I've said it before that we need to put Indigenous knowledge to work for all Canadians. This is the approach I've been taking across my portfolio at the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, Parks Canada, and Environment and Climate Change Canada, all which fall within my mandate. Indigenous knowledge makes our research more efficient and provides us with first-hand observations about the state of our land, our water, our flora, and fauna. Your knowledge and worldview needs to inform these decisions. This is important as Indigenous peoples are and have been first stewards of our land, our water, our air, and protectors of animals since time immemorial. I'm proud to say that Indigenous knowledge is a crucial element of decision-making across Parks Canada places. For example, Indigenous knowledge working groups have been created in many national parks to ensure that Indigenous knowledge informs research, conservation, monitoring, visitor safety, visitor experience, and asset management efforts. And of course, we can and we will do more. I'm very proud that our government invested $25 million over 5 years to develop a pilot program for the Indigenous Guardians Network. Those of you who strongly advocated for this important initiative were very convincing, and we look forward to making this happen. The conversations that we've had over the past year and the work that we've done together on building a new environmental assessment system have given me a new perspective on the value of First Nations knowledge, the land, the water, and air we seem to protect, and the critical importance of this for the protection of First Nations rights and way of life. That's why it's important that First Nations continue to be essential partners as we move forward with building a new environmental assessment system, and we work together to get this right. The elders emphasize the importance of protecting the land and the water and the air. When I was at Turtle Lodge, elders shared with me a copy of the great binding law that was written there. It states, "We are all brothers and sisters, and we all have a sacred responsibility to take care of and make alliance with Mother Earth." I will carry those words with me as we advance this work. What we do to Mother Earth reflects on us as a society. We cannot forget the work that she's done and why we're doing this together, nation to nation. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.